You've got questions, we've got answers. We have the man to answer them. Jeffrey Levine from Buckingham Wealth Partners. Jeffrey, welcome back to another episode of Ask the Hammer.
It is great to be back with you as always, Bob.
Great to have you. Great to have you because my inbox is full of questions from readers who like reading the newspaper, thankfully. And one of the questions goes like this. I've read that some taxpayers will feel the pinch of tax provisions that don't change as prices/inflation rises. Thoughts?
Yeah. So you could kind of look at the thresholds that we have in the tax code and divide them into two camps, if you will, those that are adjusted with inflation and those that are not. Now, interestingly enough, not all inflation is the same, right? There's CPI, we have CPIW. We have all sorts of inflation measures, right? That we might be looking at change CPI. But there's inflation adjusted numbers and there are non-inflation adjusted numbers. And obviously, when you're looking at non-inflation adjusted numbers, if it doesn't hit you or impact you this year, but it doesn't get adjusted, well, there's a greater chance that it might impact you next year. And if it doesn't impact you next year, there's a greater chance that it might impact you the year after that. In other words, if everything else is going up, income is going up, prices are going up, everything goes up over time, but this threshold doesn't, well, more and more people will ultimately fall subject to that tax. And a great example of this would be like the Social Security taxation, right? The adjusted base amount and the base amount, the two numbers in the tax code that determine whether an individual has no Social Security subject to income tax, up to 50% or up to 85% of their benefits subject to income tax. Those haven't changed in decades, right? So more and more people over the years have seen more and more of their Social Security becoming subject to income tax. And certainly not isolated to that. If we look at other areas where this would be the case, the 3.8% surtax, for instance, on net investment income was introduced back in 2013. The numbers, the thresholds were set at $250,000 for married couples, $200,000 for single filers. Well, we have had a big time bull market since 2013, where many people have seen their accounts double, or if not more, over that time. And yet those dollar amounts haven't changed. So more and more investment income these days is subject to the 3.8% surtax. And indeed, AMT was like that for years, right? Where every year Congress would kind of have to go in and patch it and say, okay, we'll increase it, because even quote unquote regular folks, right, were being hit with AMT, because while it was initially intended to be a provision that only impacted the very wealthy, it wasn't appropriately indexed for inflation. Well, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act thankfully eliminated that one from the list, but there are still, as we just talked about, many others that taxpayers should be aware of.
Right. And then there are some cases where people will benefit from the increase, the standard deduction perhaps being one, or not?
Yep. Most things are tied to inflation. So the standard deduction certainly would be there. The tax brackets themselves get indexed for inflation. Many of the credits that we have and the deductions that are phased in or phased out, things that are bad that come in or things that are good that get phased out, many of them are subject to cost of living adjustments. Even recently, Medicare Part B and Part D premiums, those are now inflation adjusted as well. So most things are, even retirement account contributions, right? Like IRA contributions, 401k contributions, 401k and 403b catch-up contributions, all of that. Interestingly, the IRA catch-up contribution is not, that's for another day. But most of those, so most of the retirement account contribution limits are. So when we look at a broad cross-section of things that people need to be aware of, most go up, but there seems to be more of this, we'll just put this in and over time it'll impact more. And it's kind of like a creepy behind the scenes, very stealth-like way of increasing taxes over time. One more good example to throw at you for one that's not indexed for inflation, the SALT cap, right? We had a SALT cap of $10,000 implemented as part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Now, that may very well change for next year, given the Democrats are currently working on a bill and there's expectations that SALT will be addressed in that bill. But that $10,000 is the same as it was, 4 years ago. And obviously prices have gone up quite a bit since then.
Right. So any actionable advice, do's and don'ts, as people think about what kind of tax planning they can do given recent inflation?
Sure. I mean, some of this involves, looking, everything in tax planning really involves what you are looking at today versus what your expectation is the future. So there's a lot of guessing, if you will, that goes along. Will the 3.8% surtax, for instance, ever be increased? Maybe you don't have to deal with that today, but if it doesn't get adjusted, you will in the future. Well, part of that might inform your planning, right? Whether you should harvest some capital gains now while you're not subject to that, whether you should do Roth convert. Effectively, tax planning is just a series of figuring out when I should accelerate certain things and when I should push them off, whether that be income or deductions or credits. It's really a timing game, right? We assume that over a period of time, your income will be roughly the same and your deductions will be roughly the same. It's just a matter of when can I kind of maneuver them around to produce the lowest lifetime tax bill. And so when something doesn't index for inflation, if you believe that'll be the case long term, you may be more likely to be hit with that tax issue down the road, or maybe more likely to cause you to have a higher tax bill down the road. That might lead you to take some of that future tax risk off the table through any way of accelerating income today when you know what that rate is. Again, that could be capital gain harvesting, intentionally paying taxes on gains now, Roth conversions, simply looking at using Roth accounts today as opposed to traditional accounts. Lots of ways to accelerate that income.
Right. So for those of us who like scenario planning and what if situations, these are the best of times, perhaps.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that's a positive way to look at it. I like that, man. I'm hiring you as my chief silver lining officer. That was great. Yeah.
Well, I want to hire you to answer more questions and tell our viewers how to ask more questions.
Done. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that at the very nice price of $0. All you have to do is send us your questions. Can't get any better than that. Like, act now while supplies last. And you can order those questions answered right here by going to Ask the Hammer at buckinghamgroup.com. Again, that's Ask the Hammer at buckinghamgroup.com. And Bob and I look forward to tackling your questions on a future episode of Ask the Hammer real soon.